Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to NACO Academy's Quickfire. This is a series of 30-minute webinars dedicated to the continuing education of angel investors, where we'll be covering the essentials of angel investing and doing some deep dives into some hot industry topics. I'm going to be your host through this journey. My name is Mike Fox, founder of Bright Lights. I've been lucky enough to have spent the last 25 years working with leadership roles and recruiting leaders for growing early and mid-stage technology companies and consulting with them on issues to do with building high-functioning teams. Today's session is on blockchain, and we're excited to have Iliana Oris Valiente. She's been a trailblazer in this space, having been among the first to recognize the impact of blockchain technology on the enterprise world. Iliana is the managing director and global blockchain innovation lead at Accenture, where she's responsible for strategic initiatives and oversight of projects using blockchain solutions. Responsibilities span industries including financial services, supply chain, healthcare, and the public sector. If you have questions for myself or Iliana throughout the webinar, please submit them in the chat box, and I'll try to get to them during the course of the conversation. If we don't have time to address your questions here, will be coming days via email. Just before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors for their continuing support of the angel investment community. They include RBC, BDC, Ryerson's Incubate Innovate Network of Canada, and the Government of Canada. So, Iliana, wonderful to have you here. And maybe if you could sort of give us a quick overview of sort of how you got to where you are right now, and then we can start talking a little bit about the marketplace and what you see going on in it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. In terms of my background, I'm actually a trained chartered accountant. And so I started my career in tax and audit before ending up in corporate finance, valuations type work. And I stumbled into this world of cryptocurrencies back in 2012 when a friend told me about Bitcoin. And given that my background was in ledgers and reviewing said ledgers, to me, the idea of a cryptocurrency that had a global distributed ledger that updated in real time, that multiple parties could see the information in real time on, was very powerful. And that's separate and aside from the fact that this technology exists in a decentralized vacuum of sorts without traditional intermediaries and third parties that we have in the financial services world. So just this combination of factors, I thought that at a minimum, this was going to be a really interesting technology to watch the evolution of. And over the course of the few years that I stayed close to this industry, I started to recognize that you could actually use the underlying blockchain for other processes that had nothing to do with Bitcoin or cryptocurrencies as a whole, but rather every business has a ledger, every business transacts with other businesses, and yet at the end of the day, we spend a lot of time doing various types of reconciliations. And so it was really that realization that led me to start pivoting my day job towards spending more and more time on this space. And that's what brings me to where I am today, working with large Fortune 500 companies and helping them design their blockchain strategy, going all the way through to hands-on keyboard software development code to build out proof of concepts and pilots to see just how this technology can be applied in the back end.
So, Iliana, maybe if you could, because I mean, it's such a broad topic, right? And it touches on so many different industries. Maybe you could sort of give us a quick high-level SWOT analysis of blockchain, you know, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats to give us a sense as to where it sits, because it's popping up all over the place, yet it remains sort of in the background, you know, except you know, unless you're talking about very, very specific business areas. So would that be possible to kind of just give us a quick kind of overview of good stuff and not so good things going on in that industry, in that part of the world?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And perhaps it's worth clarifying up front that blockchain is a very back-end technology. And I think that's part of the reason people have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. It's very difficult to touch and feel a blockchain, which is a request that I get very, very often. And I suspect that in the next 5 years or so, we're not going to be here having a conversation about blockchain, but rather it's going to be something that is embedded in the back end of our systems, and we're not thinking twice about it other than recognizing that it might enable some new functionality for an end consumer. So I think the majority of where we're seeing a lot of traction is in business to business type processes, whether in the enterprise world or in the cryptocurrency side of the overall market. So the strengths of this technology lie in how it was built. And so from a cryptography and encryption type background, it's very powerful. We look at the Bitcoin blockchain as an example, and it's quite the honeypot if you were trying to hack the system. And so far in the almost 10 years of operations, no one has successfully done that, which speaks to the power behind it. But because it's new, some of the challenges that we're seeing right now relate to the fact that there's a very small talent pool of people who understand this technology and can do something with it. Because it's new, it hasn't yet been battle tested to the extent that we would expect for an enterprise production ready deployment. And so oftentimes you hear criticisms that the technology is going through a hype cycle where the hype does not necessarily match up to the maturity of where these various technologies are today. One of the other challenges faced by this industry is nomenclature. So there is inconsistent use of terminology, and you'll hear words like blockchain or DLT thrown around, and private blockchains versus permission blockchains versus consortium blockchains versus public blockchains. And there generally isn't consistency. And so whereas a couple of years ago, when you talked about blockchain, it meant one thing, it meant the Bitcoin blockchain. Today, when you talk about it, it could mean a number of different things. And each of those areas has become a niche subfield in and of itself. So as an investor or as a business person, it's important to try to understand the overall lay of the land. And so as you're having a conversation, you understand which bucket that discussion actually fits into. Is that helpful?
Yeah. So the question then, I guess, from the investor standpoint, putting aside Bitcoin, because that's a huge sub area unto itself, is that then as to where these opportunities are, because as you said, if it sort of sits as the skeleton of a variety of different industries, in the back office scenario, back office world, then where are the opportunities to take advantage of the leverageability that it has and the kind of the uniqueness that it presents, and where does that pop out for to grab people's attention and consider it?
Mm-hmm. So the way I see the ecosystem is in a couple of different layers, where at the very bottom you have platforms. A lot of these platforms are open source. A lot of them don't have a traditional business model to go around with it, but rather they are set up as utilities. And these platforms become the basis for a number of different use cases across industries. So for example, I work in the enterprise space. We have clients that come to us for use cases in the financial services world, in the supply chain world, in the health and public safety domain. They're usually not using an underlying platform like the Bitcoin blockchain. They're usually using one of 15 or 20 different platforms that's specifically designed for the enterprise market. And we at Accenture are technology agnostic, so we'll happily build things on top of R3's Corda platform, Hyperledger Fabric, Quorum, which was built by JP Morgan Chase, and so on. So at the platform level, the investment opportunities as an angel, I think, are quite limited, just because the traditional return on investment that you'd expect isn't quite there. We're seeing movement from large foundations like the Linux Foundation to get more actively involved. A lot of this is funded via the crowd, but not necessarily through traditional angel investors. Now, in the blockchain space, on top of the platform layer is where you end up having some really interesting applications. In the cryptocurrency world, you have companies that are building cryptocurrency exchanges. You have companies that are building devices for private key management that are completely offline. Those are businesses that have clients, that have revenue streams that ultimately could result in a return on the investment from the angel's money. But that's a very separate category from what we're seeing at kind of the core platform level. And some of the other companies, in addition to servicing the cryptocurrency market and providing products there, they're building products or plugins that could be used by the enterprise community and software as a service type products as well. So those are kind of the various layers I see in this ecosystem.
So do you see then that the companies, when they are talking about their technologies and their platform and where they sit in the marketplace, do they always bring forward that they are kind of blockchain enabled? Do they highlight themselves as being unique and that's a unique value proposition for themselves, or does it sit in the background mostly?
Well, the technology itself sits in the background, but companies are certainly not shy to talk about their use of the technology. I mean, I remember in 2014 having conversations with banks, and they'll take the meetings happily, but it was always under the condition of anonymity because this technology was seen as too new and too risky for any one bank to land on the front page of the Globe and Mail or the Toronto Star as bank so-and-so is exploring blockchain. But now it has become a lot more acceptable and a marker of innovation. And so companies want to tell the rest of the world that they're actively exploring the space. We have companies like Kodak who announced just a couple of weeks ago that they're doing their own ICO, and that has led to a number of other enterprise companies saying, wait a second, should we be considering this as part of our strategy as well? And as startups, there's no shortage of companies that will throw the blockchain logo. And as you can expect with any new emerging market, you now have a bit of alphabet soup where companies will use every buzzword possible and say, we are a blockchain-enabled AI marketplace to support IoT devices in smart manufacturing. Right. And so as an investor, there's a lot of due diligence that needs to be done to try to unpack what exactly is this company doing? Are they actually using blockchain? Are they using blockchain in an appropriate manner? Where do they fall in the general ecosystem? Is there a business that could actually be built here, and so on?
And so what are the threats, because we were talking about sort of doing a SWOT analysis of the industry. What are the types of things that one should kind of dig into when when they talk about, they tout their capabilities or they tout their unique value proposition? Where would you start looking under the covers?
So a couple of areas. One would be technology. So it's still very nascent. We don't have an army of PhD type graduates that have spent the past 10 years working in the blockchain space. And so doing technical due diligence is very important. I've heard clients say, I've had 3 companies come knocking on my door, and each one of them claims that they have the best products in sliced bread and that they have the fastest transactional throughput and the most security, etc. And those claims can be hard to validate if you don't have that kind of a technical background. The second category of things to be on the lookout for is business model. And just because you've slapped a blockchain into the title of your business doesn't mean that all of the usual due diligence questions that you should be asking go completely out the window. And the third piece is market size. So blockchain is still very much so in the early adopter phase, and we're starting to see some projects move out of proof of concept to pilots, and some pilots starting to tip towards production readiness. But be wary of companies that claim that their product is fully hardened, fully battle tested, and in production readiness mode, because realistically, there are very, very few projects that can legitimately claim that.
Are there specific marketplaces that are particularly sensitive to kind of blockchain capability or enablement that you see as being a real sweet spot?
Do you mean products as in industry areas?
Yes, specifically, because the areas that you delve into, I think, if I'm not mistaken, are financial services, supply chain logistics, et cetera. And And also, I mean, I know healthcare is a big area as well, and public sector, I think you're involved with this also. And so I was just wondering if there's particular sweet spots that you see as being particularly opportunistic, because, the world is still early in this game, and the definition of those that succeed are those that lead oftentimes, although they get beat up pretty well also, depending on the market.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so a couple of criteria that should be evaluated before blockchain is considered for any use case. One is, do you have a process with a number of different parties that are involved in the mix? And these parties, are they transacting a lot of information or a lot of value with each other? That's the second question. The third question is there a level of mistrust in the way that that process is currently run? And what do I mean by mistrust? So if you have a business counterparty that you deal with very often, let's say you do 80% of your business with them, do you trust them so much so that you would give them full read and write access to your SAP database instance, and in return expect that they give you full read and write access to their Oracle database? If the answer is no, which I suspect it likely isn't, otherwise the chief technology officer at your organization might have a word with you after this call, then there is that kind of level of mistrust. Then and only then would I say that blockchain could potentially be a technology enabler to support an overall business process. And so with those three criteria in mind, when you evaluate a possible use case in an industry, like let's say supply chain, for example, then you start to see where the benefits are. So we've done work in the food supply chain, working with a poultry manufacturer. So understanding the whole process from a chicken egg to the time that the egg gets hatched, to the time that the chicklet grows up to become a plump chicken, to the time that it goes to the production facility, to the time that it ends up in a grocery store shelf in a completed product. That process alone involves a number of different stakeholders with different systems that all interact with one another. And in the event that there is a recall, you could use existing technology to identify where there may have been a breach. But because everyone is using separate siloed systems, by the time you're able to do that reconciliation, it may have been 2 or 3 days, which in the event of a food safety crisis is simply too much time. So oftentimes what ends up happening is an indiscriminate throwing out of everything on the grocery store shelf that may potentially have come into contamination. So this is a use case where the application of a distributed ledger brings a very clear value proposition to all of the different stakeholders involved. And that's only one small portion of a value chain that doesn't encompass all of the raw materials that need to be produced elsewhere, the various logistics carriers that are involved, if products are moving across borders, all of the paperwork that's associated, and any trade finance aspects that go along with financing this overall transaction. So very quickly you start to see the network effects required for this technology to be very powerful at scale.
Is there not a concern, though, in terms of the security associated with that? I mean, is that not one of the big bugaboos? I mean, supply chain of chicken from egg to production facility to store is one thing, in terms of following it as it goes along its trajectory. But the security of data, and as you said, access into somebody's back-end system, and it being early stages, would it make more sense then to be looking at scenarios where security is not as big an issue in these early stages while the early adopters are playing themselves out? Or is that naive?
Well, blockchains by their design are intended to be secure stores of data. The question here instead is there a trade-off between security and transparency, right? Because in this scenario with the poultry, you might have 5 participants that are in this network. The information that's in the system is secure. But if any one of these participants has poor operational security practices inside of their organization and somebody is able to hack into their system, then yes, that person does have theoretically view into what's going on in that overall network, but not necessarily the ability to change a transaction that's been recorded in that ledger. So it adds an extra layer of questioning that needs to take place.
And is it clear as to what those sort of questions should be, and what those restrictions should be in terms of considering opportunities and considering places to perhaps invest?
They're certainly becoming clearer, and as we see more projects go from proof of concepts to pilots, best practices are emerging, and a lot of the time we're seeing consortiums being built up that include participants from multiple industries, and questions we often get asked are around governance of this consortium and how do we allow new members in? What are the security protocols that each participant must have before they join this network? How do we potentially offboard a participant after they're no longer required as part of their network? So a lot of those questions are emerging.
So you were mentioning about the lack of resources, it being early stages in the industry. And so as one evaluates the different companies and the potential opportunities to invest in, historically, angels who are early in the game invest in a team, right, and leadership. So what would you say are some of the criteria and where would the background of the people be coming from that would perhaps lead them into this space that would give one comfort that that they're going down the right path? I mean, putting aside honesty and integrity, which is kind of a given that you're looking for in somebody. I was just wondering if there's, a specific industry background that's most pertinent or most relevant to expertise and to strength in this space.
Mm-hmm. So as a team, you would definitely be looking for two people, at least one that has a strong business background and someone that comes with a very technical background. This is not an industry where it would be sufficient to have a business first founder that then is looking to build a technical team. Given the scarcity of talent, if the idea has not been fully baked through and technically feasible, and if there isn't a group of developers that is already excited to work on this from the get-go, that is going to prove to be problematic. From a technology standpoint, the people who have a background in computer science or mathematics or distributed systems or networks design are usually the ones that tend to jump right into this ecosystem, because blockchain is ultimately at the intersection of a number of these different fields. It's helpful for the technical team to be hands-on keyboard developers as well, rather than purely approaching this from an architecture standpoint. But apart from those two sets of skills, I think a lot of the usual rules of thumb for angel investing would also hold true.
So there's no particular technologies that kind of morph themselves or that are great building blocks to get involved in blockchain. Like, is there specific technology subsets or technology platforms that are used to build these applications, or is it just open source, Java, whatever the case may be?
So I mean, open source, Java, JavaScript for more of the front-end developers, okay, commonly used, and people with that background can fairly quickly pick up Solidity, which is one of the common programming languages used in this space via Ethereum. For each of the blockchain platforms that's currently on the market, they each have different stacks because they're designed and built to accomplish different things. Usually it really depend on where that particular company or startup wants to play.
Right. So we've got about 5 minutes left, and so a couple of questions or one housekeeping issue. If there's any questions that the community wants to have, please feel free to use the chat messaging, and we'll try and get to that. And maybe as we kind of wrap up, Iliana, if there's maybe a couple of stories that you've got, of successes and maybe failures that you've seen in the space that might give people some added piquant, shall we say, to what they're looking for and what they're talking about out there in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So when we think about successes, There's obviously the Bitcoin blockchain, great. But what's been really interesting are all of the companies that are now cropping up to provide services and products in the new crypto asset class. So I mentioned earlier, you have crypto exchanges and cryptocurrency wallets that are out in the market. Coinbase is one example of an exchange that was one of the earliest venture-backed companies that has done exceptionally well, processing hundreds of thousands of new users in the past couple of months alone, which is tremendous growth. And what they've done is realize that, wait a second, crypto is turning into a new asset class. People need a way to interface with this new asset class. It does not require everyone to have a background in mathematics, which is simply untenable. And so how can we make it easier for non-technical people to join this ecosystem? And in return for that, can we charge on a per transaction fee basis? And that model has been hands down very successful. Other projects that have done really well, I would look at the Brave browser. The Brave browser is built by Brendan Einreich, I can never pronounce his last name, who's one of the original creators of the Mozilla browser. And he's building the Brave browser as his second kick at the can at building the browser that he wanted to build, but that the technology simply was not there when he was building it the first time around. And Brave is fundamentally flipping the advertiser, publisher, consumer of data relationship completely on its head. They did a very successful crowdfund campaign for BAT, the basic attention token, that powers their platform. And ultimately, as a user of the platform, if I'm watching an ad, I'm actually getting paid by the publisher of the ad for my attention and get paid for providing advertisers access to my personal information. So it's a very different business model from what you would expect from an advertising technology company, but it's been very successful nonetheless. So two very different businesses, but two very successful examples.
Iliana, quick question. Is there some resources that we might delve into in the, I've got a question here. What advice would you give someone with a business background who'd be interested in getting into the blockchain industry? Just
Great question. So, I mean, there are a couple of sources of information that are a really great starting point. Coindesk.com is the de facto industry newspaper. I guess we'll call it that. It's purely digital. They have lots of blockchain 101 guides and industry guides as well. So I would say follow your interests. If you have a business background and you're interested in industry X, chances are that there is a blockchain application for that industry X. Or there is a need for people with product owner backgrounds, project management backgrounds, finance backgrounds, marketing backgrounds, all of those functions that you need in a traditional company, you also need in a blockchain domain. Right. There are a couple of books on the topic. So Blockchain Revolution by John Tapscott is a crowd favorite. He also has a series of videos and a TED Talk, I believe. Andreas Antonopoulos is another great speaker. He has a series of YouTube videos. He focuses more so on the cryptocurrency public markets side of things rather than on the enterprise world. So those are just a couple of good starting points.
Great. Okay. Is there anything that you'd like, any last point that you'd like to make about what you do and what Accenture does that might be of value to the community out there? That maybe you've got a 30-second infomercial here?
Well, our services are typically geared towards large Fortune 500 companies, and we help them from A to Z, everything from education as to what this blockchain thing is, all the way through to let's build a concept or a pilot or help you get this into production. And so that's really our bread and butter. I also have another role that I wear as the chair of the board of a nonprofit, ColliderX, and we're actually promoting technical research and development in fields that are related to blockchain technology. So we're collecting research topics from large corporates as well as from small startups that they want to address, but simply don't have the resources at hand to go and hire 30 PhD students and put them on payroll for 3 years. And so we're matching those research topics to researchers. So if you have people in your network that have a PhD or advanced degree in a technical discipline and are interested in going down the blockchain rabbit hole, then by all means, feel free to send them our way.
Great. Listen, Iliana, thank you so much for taking the time today. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us on NACO's Quickfire Academy. One last time, just thank our sponsors, RBC, BDC, Ryerson's Incubate Innovate Network of Canada, and the Canadian government for the dedication to furthering the education and growth of the angel investment community. Our next session is going to be on the cannabis industry, of which there's no shortage of buzz. I had to throw that in, sorry, I couldn't help myself. Thanks you for your interest, and feel free to let others in the community know about the series if you feel it's been of value. Again, Iliana, thank you, and everyone have yourself a wonderful day. All the best.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, bye-bye.